Good morning, folks. Scott Howard here, local author and teacher. I'm coming to you direct from my classroom at Brentsville District High School. You may hear a bell or announcements come on behind my head. I'll try and pause it when that happens, not to interfere. I'm sorry that I'm recording this for you and publishing it to YouTube instead of being live. When Catherine asked me to do it, I didn't have any conflicts, but I'm a father of two, and both of my sons have soccer games today at the same time. So, and that time conflicts with this time, and so I'm on dad duty. I'm out on the sideline of a soccer game. When it's over, I'm at the soccer games at the Wharf in Warrenton, so I should be able to go to Fauquier High School parking lot and maybe log into Zoom and answer some of your questions and actually have some one-on-one interaction. So fingers crossed. Keep your eyes open, and hopefully I'll be in there to see you personally and talk to you a little bit. So anyway, when I was asked to make a presentation to Write by the Rails, I was sort of given free rein on whatever it was that I wanted to talk about. And as a creative writing teacher and as a chronic reviser myself, I thought I would focus my discussion today on revision. There's kind of three types of editors that I have discovered in teaching. There's the kind of author who writes their work and then they're done with it. They don't want to go back and edit it. They don't want to look at it again and again and again. And so it's like pulling teeth to get them to go and edit their work. Hopefully this checklist that I'm going to share with you today and talk with gives you a simple format, a way if you're that person to go down through and force yourself to do some of the edits that make your writing better. The second type of person is the type of person that wants to edit but doesn't really know where to start. Oh, told you they were coming.
Tigers, if you ride
There's going to be another bell in a minute or so. It is what it is. So those people that want to edit but don't know where to start, this is for you. This is going to be the most helpful to that group that just doesn't really feel like they know what they're doing there. And so I'm going to give you a checklist that I give to my creative writing kids, and you can go straight down it with every piece of writing that you do and improve it. Now, this is geared, of course, towards writing fiction, but it works very well with memoir. It works very well with prose, even if it's creative nonfiction or whatever it happens to be. There's even a lot of overlap here with poetry. A lot of the stuff that you look at when you're looking at a work of fiction is the same kind of stuff you look at when you're looking at poetry and the content of your poem. So, bear with me, even if this isn't your genre. Obviously I write sci-fi and fantasy, and that's probably not your genre either. I've got some I've got some activities for you afterwards. That bell really threw me off. But the third kind of editor is the kind I am, the compulsive editor, the person who goes back and edits again and again and again. When I was writing my first novel, 3 Days and 2 Nights, I think that I ended up actually getting stuck. Like I wrote the first, I want to say, third. But what I ended up doing was every time I sat down to write, I would revise what I had already written before I started writing new stuff. And so I got to the point where I had revised the beginning so many times that it was like solid gold. I loved it. It was beautiful, and everything that I wrote by comparison sucked. It was awful, and I felt like nothing that I could do would compare to what I had started out doing, and so it was a struggle. I actually had to make a bargain with myself. I had to be like, Scott, you can only edit the chapter before the one that you're writing, and that was good because it allowed me to reread what I had just written and get myself back in the right mindset, and I was able to edit that chapter. But then I would have to move on, and I wasn't able to edit the whole book until I finished the whole writing. If I hadn't done that, I'd probably still be working on the book now. So it forced me to get there. But the truth is that when you write a novel, when you go through and you get it done, the editing of a book takes maybe 2 times as long as the actual writing of it, if you want it to be good, if you want to get it where you need to be. And it can be so tedious and so difficult to complete that you sort of give up on it, or you don't want to do it, and you need to break it down into little bits and work your way through from beginning to end in a way that doesn't overwhelm you. Take it a chapter at a time, take it a section at a time. do that kind of a thing. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking about this, and I'm going to shift over. So what you've got here on the share screen that I'm sharing with you is the editing checklist, like I said, that I use with my creative writing kits. And they all come in at different abilities. They all come in with different interests. But this seems to be something that helps them all improve as the year goes on. So there are 8 items on the list, and I will. It's a document in Google Docs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the share settings here. We'll go to share, and we'll go to anyone with the link can view it, and then I'm going to copy the link and paste it at the bottom of the YouTube video that I'm recording right now, so that you can go in there and you can get yourself your own copy of the editing checklist. You can print it out, you can save it, you can do whatever it is you need to do with it. Here's the editing checklist I look for. For the first 3 things on this list, I'm just going to go down the list and explain them and hopefully help you use them in your own work. For the first 3 on the list, you want to use the Find section in Microsoft Word or the Control F in Google Docs. I actually think Microsoft Word, the latest version, has changed to Control F as well, which conforms to everything else. So you just hit Control F and it brings up this little Find menu, and then in whatever document you want, you look for whatever it is you're looking for. So the first thing is something my editors really pounded into me, especially in my first book. I had figured it out and was not nearly as bad about it in the second book. But in my first book, I used a lot of adverbs, and it turns out that editors hate adverbs. And here's why. An adverb is an indication that you're using an imprecise verb. I always tell my students, as my editor told me, that an adverb is an aftermarket modification of an ineffective verb to try and force it to be effective. So you've got a verb in there, but it's not exactly what you want. So you're like, well, let me put an adverb in to modify its meaning. Why? I guess that's the question. So what you need to do is just search your document. Search for ly. What you do in this bar up here is you put a ly and then a space. And the reason you put a space is because it's going to bring up lys at the ends of words, right? And that's going to catch the majority of your adverbs. Most adverbs end in ly. Not all of them. There's plenty of them that don't, and they're much harder to catch. Your best job is to catch those when you're just reading and trying to check it. But they're very difficult to catch, but you can catch ly adverbs real easy. So this will bring up most of the adverbs in your work. So your job is to start tightening your verbs. Instead of ran quickly, use sprinted, right? English has a ton of words, and there's a precise verb for almost every action. Not all of them, but for almost every action that a person can take. And so you can use a thesaurus, you can start branching out a little bit, but try and get rid of your adverbs. I got a few in here. And you know, if I was editing this to be basically what adverbs do is adverbs are difficult because of the way that English is constructed as a language, right? With an adjective, it comes before the word that it modifies. So when you get to the green apple, you're already picturing green in your head before you picture apple, and so the apple, boom, pops into your head as green. But with adverbs, we mysteriously put the adverb after the verb, which makes no sense. So, you know, ran quickly, you're picturing somebody running, and then all of a sudden you have to like speed it up in your head, or, you know, talked slowly. You've got to revise the image that your brain has already created with a word that comes after it, and that's not intuitive, and it really slows down your reading. And it's also like, if there's a better word, a singular word that's better, why not use it? So anyway, this is a relatively easy one to do. You can just run your whole document through this search and go through. It gets tedious, so I wouldn't do the whole thing all at once. I would do a little bit here and a little bit there. Just stop at logical places where you know where you can resume. So that's number one. Number two, I tell my students, is another Control F function, passive writing. You want to search for inactive verbs. Again, you're going to put a space before and after, so you only come up with the words themselves and not as part of another word. But your inactive verbs are things like was, were, had, has, is. Anytime you're using that kind of a, I guess sometimes they call them linking verbs, whatever the case, anytime you're using that, you're not using an action. And active prose is much more engaging for a reader than inactive prose. So instead of writing Frank was running, all you got to do is write Frank ran. or better yet, Frank sprinted, right? And so you can search up those words. Same thing. You can go space was space. Hey, look at that. I did a pretty good job on this one. Or space is space. Not as well. And anytime you're doing this, you can eliminate, you're not going to eliminate all of them. I mean, we have to write the way that we have to write, but you can eliminate a lot of them and you can make your language a lot more active. And it's especially important that when you find a paragraph that has a lot of these, because this is what I do. I'm going along and writing and everything seems to be going pretty well. And then all of a sudden I'll find that I have 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs all in a row that are chock full of these wases and wers and ises and just terrible verbs that have no action in it. And the pace of the story drags, slows down, and it's a much more active, or it's much better for your reader if you can activate those. So we want to get rid of passive verbs. And another type of passive verb, this is sort of the same thing as to be verbs. The word to often shows up in passive phrases. You'll find things like Frank began to run. I mean, that's even worse than Frank was running. It's more words, it's more verbose, and to less effect. We don't need to see Frank beginning to run. We just need to see him running. So again, Frank ran or Frank sprinted, way better. So what you can do is you can run another to be search. So Frank ran's much more direct and active. Work on losing the to be verbs. They slow your prose and bore the reader. In prose, when the choice is to be or not to be, as a general rule, pick not to be. So you can just look for 2 verbs, space, to, space. Now, it's not always going to show up in a verb. So this one's a little more tedious to go through and look at them all. But if you find it in a verb pairing, to run, to drink, to eat, you end up with a slower construction, and you can fix that. Now, all of these are pretty easy fixes. They're sentence edits, they're line edits. And now we're going to move on to some of the more difficult stuff. Sentence length. I don't know how many times probably your high school teachers have talked to you about sentence length back in the day, but one of the keys to readable prose, readable fiction, readability in general is that you vary your sentence length. You know, your sentence length should constantly vary. You should have long, complex sentences, but they should be interspersed with short, pithy, quick sentences. So if all your sentences are long, what you end up doing is drowning your reader. Open up Dickens and try and read it. Better yet, open up Paradise Lost by John Milton and try and read that. And I know these guys got published and were famous during their time period, but people don't tend to read them as much anymore because it's so much mental effort to follow the path of their sentence. You can give people a sentence like that every now and again, but if you give people all sentences like that, they quit on you. And it was a lot easier to publish things in Victorian times than it is now because there's so much more being written. Not only that, but the gatekeepers are gone with all the self-publishing options, with all the things that are out there. The plethora, the multitude of new work being produced every month is staggering, and you have to compete with things that are written in a much more catchy way. And so in order to do that, we got to use all the tools at our disposal. So we want to vary your sentence length. Too much of the first drowns your reader, too much of the second. If all your sentences are short, it's like being hit with a jackhammer. Or listening to a machine gun shoot. It makes you sound childish. So you got to have balance. So how do I solve this? What I like to do with my paragraphs is, especially if I can print it out, I'll print it out. I'll be reading it, and then I'll just mark in the margins an L for a long sentence and an S for a short sentence. So I'd take my paragraph. And I would, some sentences are medium length, I get that, but I would put L, L, S, S, L, and I get a sense of how the paragraph is spaced out. And really, you only have a problem when you run into a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs, or all your sentences are long, or all of your sentences are short. You want to stop and be like, okay, let's break this sentence up into 2 bits, or let's see if we can have some longer constructions in here. And speaking of sentence length, there's also sentence format. Are all of your sentences constructed in the same way? That gets really boring and repetitive to your reader. So if all of your sentences begin with the same phrase, or they all begin with I, you want to think about flipping the subject and verb, or doing something that changes the construction, start with a phrase. There's lots of things you can do to vary not only your sentence length, but your sentence structure, so your writing does not become tedious. And that ties in with line edits, because you got to look at each individual line, each individual sentence. But it's relatively easy to do. Just put some notations in the margin. You can just go through and read it, and then you can go back and look for the patterns. And what's great about doing all three of these things is it starts to make you conscious of it when you're writing. So if you go through a few writings and you do the ly search, you do the sentence length edit, you start to pay attention to it as you're writing. And so you have fewer edits to do in the future moving forward. A lot of people who are writing prose have to write dialogue. There's people talking to each other. Let me get rid of this too. It's killing me. They have people talking to each other, and you got dialogue. So what I want to suggest is option or number 5, check your dialogue tags, right? A dialogue tag is at the end of when somebody's speaking, you have the word said so-and-so or something like that. And the question is, do you need them all? We tend to put more said so-and-sos in a story, especially in a first draft, than you need to. Generally, you need to eliminate tags whenever you can. They're boring. They're repetitive. They're all the things that you shouldn't have in a story. You only need them for clarity in situations when you've got more than 2 people speaking and we need to know who's talking and who's saying what back and forth. Otherwise, you can basically eliminate them entirely, or you can replace them with moments of action. For example, instead of a dialogue tag at all, let's say 2 people are having a conversation in a car and you need to indicate who's talking. At the end of somebody talking, they fidget with their keys, or they adjust their seatbelt, or whatever. You can have things that aren't dialogue tags that actually bring action into the conversation and thereby make the conversation more active and interesting without actually adding the tags themselves. But speaking of tags, should all tags be said? There's varying, the word said. There's varying opinions on this. I know that there are people out there that say that, said is fine and we should use it for all dialogue tags because the other things make your reader think and your reader doesn't want to think. I disagree as a reader and as an author. I think it's important that we vary our tags. Yes, the lion's share of your dialogue tags are going to be said. That's really how it is. But there's lots of ways for people to respond to things that are said to them, and I've given you just a couple of examples here. They could respond, they could reply, they could mumble, they could shout, they could laugh, they could suggest. Think about ways to replace some of the saids in your dialogue when you're tagging. It's probably still going to be a 2-to-1 ratio of saids to anything else, and you don't want to make your characters always chuckling or always chortling or something like that. That becomes distracting. It becomes off-putting to the reader. But so does just a repetitive use of said all the way down the page, especially if you ever listen to audiobooks. My kids listen to audiobooks all the time. My youngest son is dyslexic, and he's the most well-read dyslexic you've ever met because he loves audiobooks. But one of the things, especially with young adult and middle grade books, is this machine gunny repetition of the word said, and it drives me nuts when I hear it being read out loud. And maybe that's just me, but I really don't think it is. I think if it bothers me like this, it's probably bothering other people. And the goal of good writing is that people stay in your story. They stay in the now with you in the world that you've created. And anything that you do in writing that distracts from that pulls them out of the moment that you've carefully crafted the prose to bring them into, we need to get rid of that. You need to keep them there. You hook them and you keep them. And one of the things that can be off-putting is dialogue tags if you don't use them correctly. And speaking of dialogue, you need to make sure, and I think most of you know this, when you're writing dialogue, whenever you move to a new speaker, it's indentation. You either enter an indent or enter in space between, depending on the format you're using in your line. But make sure that you go to a new paragraph after you change speakers from one person then another person. Old books don't always do this, and so it can get confusing, especially if you're trying to edit and you're looking at models and you're like, hey, my favorite book is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Guilty. You might go to that and you say, hey, here's a paragraph in which 3 different speakers speak and it's all in the same paragraph. Don't do that. New modern rules, like not even that modern, every time it's a new speaker, new paragraph, period. Uh, there are complications to dialogue as well, though, and I'll just talk about one of them really quickly. One of the interesting things is sometimes somebody has a monologue. They talk so long that they need a new paragraph within their dialogue. How do you do that? Well, you can do that. You just don't end the dialogue. You don't put a quotation mark at the end, and you just leave that off. And then you continue your quotation mark on the next one. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. It depends on the format that your publisher wants in their work. All right, next let's talk about character voice. So you've written a story and you've got a bunch of characters in it and they all have dialogue. One of the easiest mistakes to make as a writer is that all of your characters sound the same. You're the author, and so they all end up in your voice. There's not enough differentiation there, and so it becomes sort of numbing to the reader, and it's difficult for the reader to tell the characters apart. So what you can do in revision, and this is something I always encourage, is you can give your characters individual voices. So you want to think about who they are and how they talk. You know, what personality do they have? Are they abrupt? Do they make jokes? Are they always optimistic and cheerful? Like, these things are in character development when you're thinking about who your characters are and how they interact. But these things all show up in the dialogue. So whatever your character's personality is needs to show up in their dialogue. But more specifically, let's say you've already done all that. How do we differentiate the characters still further? Well, you want to think about what idioms do they use. What regional words do they have? How do they view the world, and how do they express their view of the world, and how does their upbringing affect the way that they express their language? I'm not talking necessarily about writing in dialect. That's really difficult to do, especially if it's not a dialect that you yourself have a lot of familiarity with. I'm just talking about throwing in a mannerism here or there. You got a character who grew up next to the ocean. They're going to use ocean metaphors. You got a character who grew up in the mountains. They may use different terms to refer to different plants, or things like that. So different people communicate verbally in different ways, and you want your characters to display this, and you want your characters to be consistent. So make a cheat sheet for yourself about the idioms and the mannerisms that your individual characters use, and then try and stay faithful and true to that and add to it as you go through the story. I have in my novel 3 Days and 2 Nights, I ended up with a character who, to differentiate his dialogue from other characters, he sort of talks in alliterative verse. Whenever there's an opportunity for him to alliterate, I sort of sneak that in there. I've also got a character who is a Knight of the Round Table, and he speaks in sort of an elevated way. He uses larger words and more complex sentence structure than other characters who are sort of low-born. And these are the kinds of things. So it's not only just word choice, but it's the way they structure their thoughts, and the allusions, the references they make, and those sorts of things. Wow, I'm already at 23 minutes, so I gotta bring this to a close. Next, we can look at narrative voice. Every story has a narrator, right? So what I'm asking you to do as you do your revisions is think about your narrator. What kind of voice is your narrator? There are these logical divisions between types of narrators, like the limited narrator versus the omniscient narrator. Does the narrator know everything, or does the narrator only know what certain characters know? Is the narrator in first or third person? Are you looking out of the narrator's eyes? That's first person. I wrote a story in second person once. It was wild. But it got published too. Anyway, you can write in the third person. That's the most common. That's the voice of the storyteller. Everybody's he, she instead of I. You got tenses. It's very common now, especially in young adult literature, to write in the present tense. I can't do it. It kills me. But the traditional past tense narrator is stuff that happened in the past. But the present tense narrator, everything's coming at you now. It adds a urgency. It adds a level of intensity to the story. So if you want a story that's particularly intense, you may want to consider writing it in the present tense. Invasive and non-invasive narrators. Is your narrator a character in the story? Do they sometimes address the reader? You. Does a second person creep in? Or is the narrator strictly a voice of God that is not invasive into the story at all? This is a question. Is your narrator reliable or unreliable? Is your narrator telling the truth, or is your narrator trying to lie to your reader? Is your narrator crazy? Does your narrator labor under some kind of misconception that the reader doesn't figure out until towards the end. I think about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart here. Um, that narrator is clearly in earnest, but he's also crazy. And so what can you trust that he says, and what can't you trust that he says? So these are all things to think about when you're thinking about your narrative voice and what kind of a narrator you're putting out there. Whatever you pick, you have to be consistent. If your narrator isn't consistent, you lose your reader every time. So your selected narrative voice also sets the tone for the piece. So identify your tone. I'm serious. Like, take a second and think about what emotional quality, what feeling you want the story to evoke in your reader. And so when you do your edits, you want to look for words that are out of place. If your tone is dark and suspenseful, for example, your narrator has no business using childish words or happy words. You want to keep your tone consistent throughout. And in order to do that, you have to check your language, the words that you use and the way that you use them. So this is probably the hardest one to accomplish. And it's also, readers don't think about tone. They don't think about narrator. They take the story as it comes to them. But when you do this well, it ties everything together because your narrator is always speaking. Even in dialogue, the narrator is the one who's delivering the story. So you want to think about the narrator as a character. Even if the narrator is not a character in the story, the narrator is the voice that's telling the story, and it's the most important voice in the story, even though it often gets overlooked. Last thing, and then I'm going to shut up, I promise. Let's talk about cuts. The hardest decision to make is to cut your own writing. It's like lopping off a finger or pruning a branch of a tree that you've cultivated from a seed or a nut, but it's got to be done. So if a scene of dialogue or if a whole section of your story is not connected to the central plot or essential to character development, you got to cut it out. It doesn't matter how great it is, doesn't matter how proud of it you are, and it hurts. So here's my suggestion. Cut first and ask questions later. So save an uncut version of your document. Go to your document right now, change the title to uncut, and then leave the rest of the title and save it. Then go back to your original one and start cutting away. But as you cut stuff, drop it in a new document. And you label that document cuts, because you never throw anything away. You never know when it's going to be useful. And it helps you to be able to make cuts when you know you're not throwing things away entirely and that they're still there for you to get. And you can still go back at the uncut version and look at where they showed up in the story. But a lot of times for me, what ends up happening is stuff that I cut from one story ends up showing up in one way or another in another story. Or it finds its way into the story in a different way or in a different place. Whole conversations have sort of lifted and entered other dimensions, I don't know what you want to call it, this way. And a story is always better for cutting. At the end of the day, you want to cut to the chase. You want the story to flow. You want it to move faster. Readers want to get through it. And so get out the pruning shears and cut as much of it as you can. And then you can smooth over those rough edges. Cuts always leave rough edges. It's like cutting something with a saw. It's not sanded. It doesn't feel natural because it flowed naturally the way you wrote it originally. So after you've cut it, then you're going to have to go back in and make those careful line edits and maybe add a transition here or there and sort of sand those bits and make them the way you want them to be. So that's my editing checklist. Like I said, I'm going to copy the link and put it at the bottom of the YouTube video. And then I've got some work for you. So basically, this is another document. I'll put it down there in the comments on the YouTube video as well. But I know you guys like to do a little bit of work, a writing activity. And so what I've got here for you is a page of an unedited draft of one of my short stories. So I haven't edited it all. This is the first one. Obviously, I've since published it, and I've edited it, I don't know, 16 times. But this is the first draft. So it's a medieval suspense thriller, just to give you a sense of the tone, about a Welsh horror called The Gwyll. So what I'm asking you all to do is copy the text. It's one page. I've got it in one page. And paste it into your own document. And then I want you to go through the various steps that I went through in the editing checklist and try and improve it. Take a look at the adverbs. Take a look at the passive verbs. I mean, they're in there. It's not my best writing ever. Take a look at the dialogue and the way that it's written, and see what you can improve. And either by yourself or with a partner. I don't know how you guys do with breakout rooms in Zoom, but like you could open up a breakout room with Zoom, go in with a partner, and talk it through and make some improvements. I don't know how much time you all have or how much time you want to give it, but I'll let the moderator figure that out and assign you a certain amount of time and go through and make edits. And then we'll come back and hopefully you'll meet with another person or another pair of people that looked at this and made their own edits, and you can talk through the edits that you made and why you made them and what sounds better. And hopefully, I think a lot of times doing the work, especially not on your own work, so you don't feel like you have to be nice. Go ahead and be as mean as you want to. Look at it and find everything that you think is ineffective and rework it. But then you can come back and you can look at what somebody else did with the same material and why. And that will give you, I think, a sense of the options and the opportunities for revision that are out there for every work that you've ever written. So anyway, I'm going to shut up now and I'm going to bring this video to a close, and I will come in hopefully here in a little bit and be able to answer your questions and take your comments and thoughts and all that kind of stuff. All right. Thank you very much.